So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Simon McDougall. I am Executive Director for Technology Policy and Innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office. I've got the first keynote. Sandra has the pleasure of the second keynote before the panel. And we're talking around GDPR AI and automated processing and decision-making. The hard thing for me with this presentation is normally when I'm talking about automated decision-making, explainability, and GDPR, I steal a lot of Sandra's stuff, and I claim it as my own, and I get away with it. But now she's sitting there, so I can't just steal her stuff. That's a problem. But I want to just make sure that as we talk around this, we make sure we broaden this out. Most of you will be familiar with the GDPR to a lesser or greater extent. Doubtless in this discussion, we're going to zero in on some points around explainability, some points around automated decision-making, and they are critical. But we should keep in mind when we're talking about AI and ethics and automated decision-making that it's part of the broader GDPR remit. And for all of this processing of personal data, we still have fairness, we still have accountability, we still have notice provisions, we still have privacy by design. And those things are absolutely critical. And as we talk about the limitations of the GDPR sometimes and the challenges we still have the bigger picture as well. That all said, there are issues around decision-making and privacy and GDPR and how it all ties into AI. And I'm not going to steal Sandra's thunder here, but I mean, her recent work on possible right to reasonable inferences and the like is just excellent. And she talks there around the differences between the GDPR being focused on input data and the outcomes or in terms of output data. There are issues around what we really mean by an explanation and what can and can't be done there with GDPR. And there's issues around what it means to actually be able to object to automated processing in GDPR and what people can really do about this. And one thing that where I think GDPR has missed a beat there is around a reliance on putting a human in the loop to actually make a difference, as if having the human in the loop makes everything okay. We just had a great panel before this looking at some aspects of gender and AI, and I think most of us in this room at least, but maybe not in the outside world, have thought through how humans bring their own suitcase of biases and conscious and unconscious prejudices to any decision that they make. And so when the GDPR says, well, if it's a fully automated decision, then get a human in the loop, make sure that you can actually have it reviewed by a human, that's not necessarily healthy. Depends on what the human is. And I don't think any of us humans here are necessarily feeling confident that we are going to make fully unbiased decisions. So how do we balance this up, and how do we get something better and more meaningful around addressing AI and GDPR and human beings making decisions, which isn't just relying on fallible humans that are making the same mistakes again and again and again? I was over at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona a couple of months ago, and there it was all 5G and robotics, every stall 5G and robotics. And one of the largest stalls there had some amazing robots, and they did two things. They did security monitoring around buildings, and they did household chores, such as tidying up and the like. And lo and behold, all the security robots had male names, and all the cleaning up robots had lady names. And when we put this to the gentleman running the store, he looks at us blankly. And so we're just reinventing the wheel if we're relying on humans just to actually think through problems we haven't thought through ourselves. So what can the ICO as a regulator do in this debate? I think there's two sides to that. I think on the one hand, the ICO has to be just engaged in this discussion. We're at the very early stages of looking at AI and ethics in practical reality, in the real world. And we're at the very early stages of the GDPR as well. It's only a year old, and a lot of that year has just been absorbing the basics. So we have to be involved in this ongoing discussion taking places in rainy tents like this, where we can really start to get to the bottom of these challenges. And at the same time, as a regulator, we need to actually get on with it, because AI and machine learning in particular is being used out there in the real world right now. It's being used to inform decisions around the world with parole, or deciding which at-risk children may or may not get put into care. It's being used to decide what adverts you get. It's being used in facial recognition technology. So we need to be intellectually engaged as a regulator in this discussion, but actually we're enforcing on it and guiding on it at the same time. And that's our challenge, really, is we can stand back and discuss, and we should discuss, some of the challenges we have around the limitations of GDPR and automated decision making. But actually, we've got to use the tools that we have available, and we have to use them now. And we have to keep on enforcing on that. So that's our challenge, is to try and improve the car as it's going along at 70 miles an hour. We are doing other stuff along the way. So I'll highlight two areas. We have our Project Explain, which is a joint piece of work with the Turing Institute around explainability of decision making. And that's actually what people expect to hear as decisions around when AI makes a decision relating to them. Our interim report is just out. The highlight I'd bring to you is that context really matters. We had citizens' juries. We're talking to people, real people, in inverted commas, around how they understood AI and what they expected from it and what an explanation meant to them. So it's not like explaining the black box in a deep learning neural network algorithm. This is what needs to be explained to people. And context mattered. They would, in a scenario, say, where they were being told by a medical professional around a decision taken in relation to what kind of treatment they should get, they were more happy to have less of an explanation and having more accurate AI than if it was a decision around recruiting, or actually even a decision around the justice system, where they had less faith in the institution. So context matters to people. That's important. The other big piece of work we have right now is around our AI audit framework. So some of you have been seeing the blogs on this. We've had an amazing reaction to this. We're building our own framework, mainly to help us as a regulator understand what good looks like when we go in and audit use of AI, when personal data is being processed using AI. But it'll also drive good practice and good standards elsewhere, because we're going to share it with everybody. And we're currently issuing different blogs and different aspects of our AI audit framework and asking for input. And we've had an amazing set of feedback already, and we're going to keep on issuing blogs over the summer. I think the fourth one's just about to come out. So that's the kind of things that we're doing. But I'll finish off with a couple of thoughts on where I think we're going to end up enforcing on this in the future around automated decision making, pro AI, and GDPR. I think that it's going to end up for us being a little bit like cybersecurity is now, where we spend a lot of time as a regulator and with the security community looking at really interesting, quite exotic exploits. So zero-day exploits, nation states, North Korean ninjas descending from ceiling panels and stealing your hard drive. And it's high-level stuff. And yet, if you look at what we end up enforcing against the regulator, it's SQL injections and social engineering and people leaving stuff on trains. It's the basic stuff. And I think AI may go in the same direction, and we're trying to capture that with our framework, our AI audit framework, capturing both the mundane and the exotic and the extraordinary. I think a lot of the stuff that we're going to end up enforcing against in the next 5 years, next 10 years around AI is going to be silly, basic things where people should have known better. And so it's going to be very basic errors around how you set targets for an algorithm, or the kind of training data you acquire. It's going to be people overselling what the AI can do, and people trying to save money buying poor AI or relying on third parties who don't think things through. Those are where I think that we're going to have a lot of the challenges. So we should focus on the interesting stuff and the exotic stuff and the cutting edge thinking. We're trying to do that as well. We're really investing in research in this area. But we shouldn't forget the knitting. I think that's going to be just as important. Anyway, at that point, I'm going to pause and hand over to Sandra.
And just before you, just so I interrogate you before you sit down, Simon, and by the way, maybe soggy out there, but we're not going to have a soggy conversation today. You talked about Project Explain, which is a really interesting piece of work that you're carrying out. And I've got your conclusions here. You've talked about the AI audit and all that side of things as well. But one of your key conclusions in here is there are several challenges in explaining AI decisions, including cost, commercial sensitivities, and a lack of internal organizational accountability. However, technical feasibility was generally not considered an issue. Now, I find that a really interesting conclusion because quite often that is raised as an issue. And as you said, you talked about AI audit. Quite a lot of people who talk to me about audit say we don't yet quite have the tools. You've talked about the context. Now, that implies, therefore, quite a range of different tools. How do you square that? And how can you make a statement like that with such confidence?
Mm-hmm. So, a couple of different things wrapped into that. I think that let me focus on both the actual explainability piece first, and then the bigger picture. So, with explainability, my personal opinion is that in the early days of this wave of AI, because obviously it comes through comes back every 10, 15 years. A lot of the non-explainable AI was just poorly designed and could have been designed better, and sometimes and people smarter than me have said that when often they challenged or dug into the algorithms being used, then there was more explainability on offer than otherwise. Now, that's not to say that I think that all machine learning, deep learning is going to be explainable, far from it. I do think we need to challenge ourselves as to when something is truly not explained, when it is. As a regulator, we had to prepare ourselves for when we have the question, well, we've got this neural network running, it's very complex, it can decide which one of 3 heart drugs are going to actually extend this demographic's life by 5 years. We've got no idea how it works, and it's hoovers up a huge amount of personal data. Is that okay? We need to prepare ourselves for that. That will happen. But at the same time, a lot of the time, I think AI is more explainable than sometimes people make out. When you get onto the bigger picture, and this is what we're doing with the audit framework, there are lots of controls you can put in place through the development life cycle, which are, again, straightforward things. A lot of it is basic privacy by design. A lot of it is sensible testing along the way. And again, I'm not saying it solves everything, but some of the basic controls can go a very long way.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And we'll no doubt come back to that. Sandra, and in the program, you'll see she's billed as Dr. Sandra Wachter, but I can safely now describe her as Professor Sandra Wachter.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Is that?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, cool. So my talk is called Algorithms as Decision Makers. So I actually want to take a step back because we are talking about how algorithms are now making decisions, and I want to remind us of how decisions have been made in the past and why we now care about the fact that algorithms are making decisions in our lives. So just to give you an example, traditionally, let's say in a setting where you apply for a loan, you would go to a bank and they would ask you a range of questions. They would ask you, for example, what your income is, what your savings are, your employment history, all kind of information that intuitively makes sense if you're applying for a loan. And then a decision is being made, you get rejected or you get approved, you get a certain rate for it. But this is the traditional way of how loan decisions have been made. Very traditional data sources, intuitive data that is being used. What's changing now is that we're starting to use very untraditional data sources to make the same sets of decisions. So for example here, we see that apart from the traditional data sources, very often social network profiles are now being used to make credit decisions. So some banks have chosen to use Facebook profiles the groups that you join, the things that you like, stuff that you post on it, the friends that you surround yourself with, as an underlying reason to decide if somebody should get credit. And similar here, a couple of months back, there was an interesting article to show that insurance companies are doing a similar thing. So they're using untraditional data sources, such as profile data, friends on Facebook, geolocation, and all of that, to make a decision whether you should get insurance. So we're moving away from a world where we use intuitive data to non-intuitive data and untraditional data sources. It's not just the normal information that we're used to, it's often very passive and unintentional data that we just leave behind. It could be our clicking behavior, could be our browsing behavior, eye trackment, as I said, friends on Facebook. And this data is then being used to make inferences about you, assumptions about you, whether you should get a loan, you're going to default on a loan if you're a desirable candidate for insurance. And those inferences that they draw can be very privacy invasive, and it can be very counterintuitive and unforeseeable. I have no intuitive link anymore to understand if my friends on Facebook are actually, what they say about me, if that's going to be good for my credit score or bad for my credit score. And those inferences can then be replicated endlessly, shared with third parties, and there might be a problem that might never be forgotten. So your identity, your privacy, everything that you are online can be shared. Well, the problem here is, on the one hand, that those algorithms are black box systems. And of course, this is why we want to have a better understanding of what's going on. If I don't get a loan, if I don't get insurance, I want to know why. That's the natural response that somebody will have. So I've been a strong advocate for explanations in that direction. I've been advocating for years now and working with my colleagues from the Alan Turing Institute and the University of Oxford to make those systems more explainable. Why didn't I get the loan? What do I need to do different? I feel unfairly treated. I want to challenge the decision. And even though I think that explanations are a very, very good, necessary step to increase algorithmic accountability, I think it's very important to keep in mind that explanations are not justifications. Explanations are very good, but it doesn't justify decision making. I can tell you that I didn't give you the loan because you're too short or you have brown shoes. That's an explanation. It's very transparent. It might not be justified. So actually what we need to do is look at explanations, but actually take a step back and look at justifiable ways and how we make decisions. We have a couple of examples here. What we actually should be worried about are the inferences, predictions, and opinions that algorithms make about us. With all those untraditional big data sources that are now available, for example, in advertising, algorithms can predict if somebody's pregnant and, for example, offer advertisements based on that. So the same with the loan and insurance example, the algorithm will assume if somebody's a reliable borrower or not. Employment could be the same. Somebody's predicting if somebody should be granted promotion, should get hired, fired. So here's the problem, that we don't really understand, don't really have a good framework around those inferences in addition to explanations. So I've been working on this with Brent Middlestead, and we are trying to advocate for a right to reasonable inferences. In a world where big data is being used for very important decisions about us, that we should have a right over how we're being seen by an algorithm. And I think this is very important because we're moving away, as I said, from traditional data sources to big data sources with counterintuitive results and data that just sticks with you and cannot be deleted. And the fact, this new quality of data, this new quality of data revolution that we see right now is something that policymakers already recognize as something unique that we need to regulate differently, which is why we do have a right to be forgotten now. We don't have a right to be forgotten in the analog world. I cannot go and erase somebody's memory if I don't like it. But I have some tools now available to make sure that my privacy is protected in the online world if I feel like that information on the web does no longer accurately reflect the truth. So I'm saying, if you have a right to be forgotten in the online world, maybe you should also have a right over how you're being seen, and therefore a right to reasonable inferences. And as I said, I'm a lawyer, so I'm trying to figure out whether we already have enough protections, and if we do have enough protections, then there is no need for further regulation. So I tried to look at it from a data protection framework and try to figure out if inferences, the underlying assumptions that are being made about us, are actually sufficiently protected. And in that long piece paper, The Right to Reasonable Inferences, I looked at GDPR, I looked at legal opinion, I looked at case law of the European Court of Justice to figure out what the actual deal is. And one of the questions that I asked myself is, are inferences personal data? So the underlying assumption that you're a good, reliable borrower, that you're a good worker, that you should be granted parole, for example, is that personal data? Because if it is, we do actually have some significant good protections at hand. We would have, for example, the right of access. So I can go to Google, Facebook, Amazon, and ask them, what kind of inferences, what kind of assumptions are you actually make about me? What do you think about me? And not only could I ask them about that, I would also have the right to get a copy of that information. The second thing that I would be able to do is go in and rectify data. If I feel like that I'm being treated unfairly, I'm represented not in a way that is accurate with my own understanding of myself. And I could do that. So if inferences are personal data, those two rights would kick in, which could give you actually a lot of control over how you're being assessed. So the paper that we wrote has 130 pages and around 500 footnotes. And to make it very short, I don't know what the answer is. I cannot tell you with certainty if inferences are actually personal data, but I can tell you that it actually doesn't really matter. And that's the actual problem here. It doesn't really matter if inferences are personal data because we still don't have enough protection around that. There is a judgment that says inferences are personal data. There's a judgment that says they aren't. The problem is that even in the judgment where the court says, yes, inferences are personal data, made very clear that just because something is personal data doesn't mean you get all the rights attached to it. The rights have to be interpreted according to the purpose, which is very open to interpretation. But most importantly, in three judgments, the court actually said that the remit, the purpose of data protection law is not to regulate decision making. It's not there to regulate the content of how we make decisions. If you do have a problem with how you're being assessed, you would need to find a different sectorial law that is applicable to an individual case, for example, employment law, insurance law, advertising law, and find recourse there. Data protection itself is not there to give you that. Data protection is mainly a procedural right. That means it's there to ensure that data controllers are transparent over their data usage, that you ask for consent, that the terms and conditions are on the web page, but how you regulate, what you infer, how you use it is not something that data protection actually gives you. And I think that's a big problem because very often we don't have decision-making standards. Very often we leave it in the private autonomy of decision makers, how they make decisions. Of course, they are in the confines of certain laws, for example, non-discrimination law, and insurance and all of that. But very often you will find yourself in a situation where you know you don't have a right to get a job or get a loan or attend university. So you don't actually have a sectorial law that gives you some kind of recourse. And if data protection doesn't give you that recourse either, I think that could be a problem because we are moving in a way that we make decisions in a different way. We use big data now, and I think that is qualitatively very different to the traditional way because it's passively, it's very seamlessly, it's counterintuitive, and it can be replicated endlessly. So I think we need to focus on the governance of inferences and not just on the side of the input data. So how would I propose that? That's my ongoing project that I started 6 months ago, will be going on for the next 3 years, to find possible solutions and to find a reasonable standard of assessment in various sectors. I think one thing that I think we need to move away is to see data protection in a traditional way. We have to have a more holistic concept how we protect data in the 21st century. Just to give you an example, it was a short piece that I wrote here in Nature Electronics a couple of months back, that we very much focus on the input stage of data to assess if somebody is worthy of protection. So we have anonymized data, for example, personal data and sensitive data. We have anonymized data where we say, oh, I actually don't know whose data that is. So because I cannot identify a person, we don't need data protection law to govern that because there is no risk there. Then we have personal data, and that could be my name or my age or my address, where we have GDPR standards, the normal standards. And then we have sensitive data that gets higher protection than personal data. It could be information about sexual orientation, health, political affiliation, all that. this is an artificial category that technology doesn't care about. Because everything that is anonymized can be transformed into personal data with good technology, and everything that is personal data could be potentially sensitive data. Everything can be sensitive data. We just don't know it yet. So relying just on those categories to foresee the possible consequences of inferential analytics is just not good enough. So we need to think about more holistic ways of protecting our data. The second thing, very closely connected, actually has to do with discrimination. Discrimination and bias, as we just discussed and we saw in the previous panel, is obviously something that we're all worried about because those systems will be biased, as you learn from biased data, because the world is biased. We do have non-discrimination law, obviously, and we have, for example, certain categories of people that we want to protect. We have discrimination protection against, for example, ethnic origin or disability, sexual orientation, political beliefs. All of those categories stem from historical experiences that we had in the past. Certain types of people have been treated unfairly, unjust in the past, and therefore we have decided to protect them. But again, technology has moved on in a way, because what if I told you that if you're a video gamer, gaming enthusiast, your credit score is going to drop? And it sounds very utopian, but actually it's something that could happen in the future with, for example, what's happening in China right now. There is the social credit scoring system that's being developed, being rolled out at the moment, where sources, public data sources, private data sources are being evaluated to decide if somebody's a good citizen. Good citizen could mean that you get benefits, you get, for example, better conditions at the supermarket. If you're a bad citizen, it could mean that you are not allowed to leave the country, go on no-flight list. Your kids might not be allowed to go to certain schools anymore. Being a video gamer under that regime is something that would decrease your social credit score. So obviously, those kind of groups don't have protection in non-discrimination law because historically they have not been treated unfairly. So this is just an example to say that algorithms can come up with new groups, new types of harms that we haven't had in the past. So in addition to have a more holistic privacy concept that doesn't just focus on the input data, we also need to think about new privacy harms and new group protection of privacy for groups that don't have current protection under non-discrimination law currently. Yeah, just to sum up, I think we need to not just look at the input data, just at the output data. We need to abandon those artificial categories and think about a holistic privacy approach. Understand that new discrimination harms can occur that we haven't envisioned in the past. And I think the most important thing with data protection law is that we remember why we care about privacy, and that privacy is not about data protection, it's about the protection of human beings. And that we need to remember why we do care about privacy in the first place. It's not just about making sure that the system is secure, that it's encrypted. Privacy is so much broader. If you look, for example, at the case law of the Human Rights Court, it's very much about tolerance, it's about freedom, it's about developing your own abilities, to figuring out who you are and change your personality in whatever way you say fit. Being human is what privacy actually means. It's not just about making sure that things are encrypted. And with that in mind, I think we need to move towards a more holistic way of privacy protection, which in summary is what I feel is a right to reasonable inferences. The idea how I envision that is that, of course, we don't need to care about all types of inferences. I'm very much interested in high-risk inferences. That means inferences that are very privacy invasive, inferences that could be reputational damaging, inferences that are being used for very important decisions, loan decisions, job decisions, decisions being used in criminal justice, and move away from just trying to be transparent and explainable about things, but actually having an ex-ante justification. We as society have to have a discussion if certain types of data uses are actually normatively acceptable. Is it acceptable to draw inferences, for example, on sexual orientation based on browsing behavior? Is it legitimate to use browsing behavior or friends on Facebook to make loan decisions in the first place? We need to have a discussion around whether we want those types of decision-making procedures in the first place. And once we have that, then we can talk about explanations. Then we can talk about that individuals should have the right that things are being explained to them, and then subsequently give them the ability to contest that kind of decision making if they feel that they've been treated unfairly. Just to say that I think AI and inferential analytics are very powerful, fascinating, and I'm overwhelmed with what we can actually do and what's possible. But I think it's now time that we not just focus on what is technically possible. I think it's also time that we focus on what's reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandra. Now, you've really laid out a challenge there in terms of saying we need to have a right to reasonable inference, and I take that as being really the right not to have your behavioral data misused, in a sense. So he's a bit cognate with Shoshana Zuboff and surveillance capitalism and so on. So we're on the same page here. But of course, what you've got representative of the ICO on the platform. You've got the chair of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. You've got a practitioner here. You've got a parliamentarian here. Who is going to start the ball rolling in this new landscape?
Yeah, I think it has to be all of us. I think that the approach that the ICO took to actually get citizens included and ask them what they want is very, very important. Very important to get every stakeholder involved in this discussion, because it's our future, right? It shouldn't be just decided on from one stakeholder, just from industry, just from academics, just from the regulatory side. It has to be everybody that has a voice in this discussion.
So we need to get in a huddle afterwards, basically. Excellent, thank you. Right, and now this is, in a sense, the counterpoint part of the proceedings. We have Roger Taylor, who's the chair of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation with us, who is going to kind of respond and make a few comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. So two incredibly helpful and very complimentary talks, I thought. I mean, I think that it's really impressive seeing how the ICO are picking up this challenge. And as Sandra put it, what we're really worried about is the fairness and the accuracy of the decisions that are being made. And there are some issues about how far GDPR provides the tools to do that, but the ICO is absolutely exploring that to the full and trying to see how it can address those issues. Hugely welcome the approach to explainability. And I think one of the things that the interesting issues that will come out as we discuss this is what is the different levels of explanation. So to take your example of an algorithm that's identified a particular pharmaceutical as treating a disease, it's unclear exactly why it's come to that decision, just as often we're unclear about the mode of action of a pharmaceutical, but we still trust the evidence that it works. And as an individual, I certainly might be content that I don't need a specific explanation of why information about me has determined that this is the right drug for me to take. However, I don't think we're ever going to be in a situation where society collectively isn't going to want some sort of explanation of the evidence that this is the right thing to do, that the algorithm has been put together in an appropriate way, and we have enough of understanding of the data we put into it, why it might make sense and why it might be a reasonable way to behave. So I think, but those issues will, I think, come out over time. And then to Sandra's point, I mean, Sandra is pointing to very clearly to the limitations of this, to the fact that GDPR is built around ideas around legitimate interest or personal control through consent, and it's very unclear how those mechanisms work in terms of really assuring a fair decision. It's great. I totally, it would be, I think, enormously helpful if it was inferences were regarded as personal data. I think there's obviously a proportionality issue here. Inferences that are created in a split second to decide about where an advert goes. You might want to sort of draw a line somewhere, but if you're making a big inference about somebody, in the same way that you might assign them a diagnosis, that sort of information should be personal information. And that's great that it gives me rights then to access it, because it gives me right to challenge it, but there is a real question about my capacity to really do that. And so the question then is, well, who are the organisations who are the bodies that can actually take a view on what is a reasonable inference, and what is a fair decision, and where's that power going to lie? Because, and again, to go back to Simon, the work they're doing on the audit framework is fantastic, but it is very clear that we cannot police the fairness of decision-making across the whole economy through the ICO trying to leverage GDPR to the maximum. Other people are going to have to take this on and establish within each area what is the best mechanism for doing that. But very helpful talks, I thought.
Great. So, Roger, I mean, what was very interesting is that you referred, in a sense, to some of the sort of contextual work that the ICO have been doing. And in a sense, I mean, do you think, therefore, that regulators, because after all, you will be advising regulators over a period of time, that they should have a kind of differential calculus, in a sense? Should they be saying, now, what is the context in which the people that we regulate are making these decisions? For instance, the Financial Conduct Authority or Ofcom or whatever. I mean, is that the direction of travel, do you think?
Yes, I think it has to be, because I think what counts as reasonable behaviour in using AI to determine medical treatments or credit decisions or HR decisions is not the same as the standard needed to decide which advertisements to display on a website. So we do have, there is a degree of proportionality. There's also the specifics of what you need to know to the level of not least expertise and understanding of the information sets and the types of information that might be relevant within different areas will vary. So that this is something that in each sector is going to have to take on a lot of responsibility, but with a lot of cross-cutting skills, a lot of cross-cutting issues that the ICO in its audit work is already.
I'd about to say, is that essentially a bit of a joint venture, really, in terms of codes for different regulators? I mean, especially under the GDPR and so on.
We are seeing this happening already. So the UK Regulators Network, for example, has got a programme going on vulnerability. Organisations of many different types of organisations have duties to respect people's vulnerabilities and to behave appropriately towards them. Data gives organisations the power to identify vulnerability. The extent of the duty to proactively do that, the type of response, the way in which you do it without invading people's privacy, these are common questions that banks and utility companies and others are having to question. So the regulators are trying to work together, but the answer will be different. It will be different. The answer for Ofgem and electricity companies will not be the same as the answer for a bank.
Great, thank you. And now over to Kathryn Corrick, who is, she's at the sharp end, by the way, having to, interpret some of this advice and analysis and so on. And she's a founding partner of Corrick, Wales and Partners. Kathryn.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to be championing developers right now. Are any of you developers in the room? Yes, okay. It's hard. This stuff is really, really hard. We work with everything from small startups through to global organizations, and for everyone at every level, this is difficult stuff. Let me give you just some examples. If you are an SME, you're probably going to be using other people's code, other people's third-party processes as they are, described under GDPR. You may not have very much control over what they have done, even particularly if they're much, much larger than you. And yet, as a controller, you have to kind of take as read that they've done a good job. And you have to kind of try and understand all their policies to say, oh, yeah, I can assess this. So if you're an SME, this is very hard to do. Because you'll probably be using lots and lots of other people's kind of data. Secondly, we haven't got the right training. Most people, if you are working in an organization, have not been trained around data protection or privacy law. Whether you're a developer, whether you're an innovator, you haven't really got the practices in place to know how this is done within a business. So there's some great work being done around privacy by design, but actually if you ask a developer, do you use privacy by design? They'll go, what is that? So we have got some really kind of fundamental problems with how within a business that things get developed. We've then, around communication, we've got some challenges too, because, well, who is responsible for communicating this? And mostly, we look to lawyers to do that. And lawyers are there, as much as I, am surrounded slightly by them, I love them. They are there mostly to work for their client, not the user. They're not there as their job to explain to the user how something is being done. So we've got kind of sometimes a problem there in how what a lawyer's role is. Also, they're not designers, they're not content people. Their job has never been to really use plain English. Sorry. It's been there to accurately describe the law. And so under GDPR, we've got these great things that the ICO are doing where it's saying, yes, you can do it through a cartoon, you could do it this way, you could do it that way. But at the moment, culturally, we still look to lawyers to do these explanations. So these are kind of way more fundamental things in how inferences get made. So to give you a simple example of the maturity of this market, myself and we looked last year at voice recognition software, and we did some unboxing. And you know how unboxing is, right? It's like, right, let's kind of unbox this. And we had a Google Home, and we had an Alexa product from Amazon. On the box, just the box itself, not even opening it, we had a nice big environmental sticker for recycling, how the box should be used. And then you open it up, and there's some plastic there with bits in it. And on the plastics, like, suffocate, beware, don't suffocate a child with this plastic bag. And there's a leaflet, there's a thing. Look at the leaflets. There was no explanation or symbols or anything about the actual product, about what this device could do. And you could say that would be the same, I'm sure, for phones, for any device that you might have that actually has AI somewhere along the line, let alone just normal technology, and we'll be doing it. So we haven't got a symbolic language, unlike maybe the environmental industry or safety industries and health and safety, for describing these products and what they may do, so that people can maybe then make a decision as to whether they even want to use that product in the first place or want to use a service. So we've got quite a few different kind of very practical problems, and we're still, as Simon said, we're still 1 year into GDPR, and we've got a lot of cultural changes that need to happen.
Kathryn, thank you very much. Well, seen from both ends, from the consumer and the developer, so to speak, clearly you don't think that if you like, the obligations and the communication is adequate in many ways. Seen from the developer's point of view, it's quite interesting. Dame Wendy Hall on the impact stage today, she sort of expressed some frustration about, in a sense, the framework, the kind of the fact that we were slightly more constrained, or would be constrained, than, in a sense, competitors, perhaps in the US, perhaps in China, and so on. And of course, she with a colleague has published a paper on global governance, and I think they characterize our system as, if you like, the Brussels bourgeois system. Now, is that where you sit? I mean, when you advise developers and so on, and others in this space, is there that feeling of frustration? Or, as some people would argue, is this a competitive advantage, actually? Because what we're doing by having this kind of framework, and, developing explainability and so on and so forth, we're building public trust. That's quite a long question. But you can answer it at will.
So I guess I've got two responses. The people who are developing are also using these products. So often when we're working with developers and other people, they want to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing because they're often also the users. Now, we tend to work with people who really do want to do the right thing. But, they are those, if you've seen the the employees of Google and Facebook who recently have risen up and said, you know what, we don't like the ethics of this company. We want to kind of this to be different. So we have to bear in mind that employees are also users. Secondly, I think we've been working with an East African government recently, and one of the things that we've been looking at is actually been online child protection. But they, at the moment, don't have data protection regulations, but they want to. And one of the arguments is, well, if you want to be selling to the European market, then you need to be using these standards if you want to enter into it. So I think it works both ways. That, yes, sure, I've heard Wendy kind of give this argument before, but what we're seeing globally...
Only a slight irritation, nothing fundamental.
No, but what we I think we're seeing is actually a raising of levels across the board, maybe not so much in China, but if you look at the Huawei discussions right now, Huawei are actually trying to say, no, we're not going to be using data in that way. We're not going... And so trying to make the case pro the European model rather than maybe the China model.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that China have actually just recently issued a set of ethics, of AI ethics, only I think in the last week. So maybe that's the precursor to agreement at Osaka. Did you want to come in, Sandra?
Yeah, I just wanted to because I absolutely agree with everything that you just said. I think that's very important, that regulation is not seen as a hindrance or something that stifles innovation in the slightest. And as you rightly said, like, laws shaping up around the world that actually start mimicking what we're doing in Europe. And I think there's a good chance that GDPR will be at least a global standard very soon. But apart from that, very often people say, the ethics is also a competitive advantage. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind. I just recently published a paper 2 or 3 weeks ago where I actually looked at the users' attitudes towards transparency and privacy. And it shows that users that are not aware of what's happening to the data are more likely to turn away from that product, versus people that actually know what's happening to the data. If they know they're being profiled, they're more likely to engage with that product.
Yes.
So you can actually see that users go to a company, use a product that is more ethical as opposed to another.
I'm going to come back to Roger in a minute, but Simon, do you notice a greater public awareness in this space now?
Well, very much so. We had over 4,000 contact points last year alone. That's 400,000. And it's an area where I would, it's always dangerous to disagree with Dame Wendy, but I would dare to disagree with her a little bit on this. I think the issue is that we are continually losing the trust of the majority of the population around what innovation is doing, what AI is doing. And what happens is people carry on using technologies and acquiescing until the moment where they snap and they don't. We saw that in San Francisco with facial recognition, and I think we may see it again and again coming through. And us people here, the people who are involved in these areas, whether it's academia or technology or regulation, we can convince ourselves that when there's a bit of a crisis, we'll be able to explain to the population why this technology is okay and why it's a win-win. But I'm sure that all the GM scientists thought the same thing around GM foods. And if it gets to the stage where people just go, enough, I don't trust that anymore, it's too late. And then we won't be able to actually progress the way we want to progress.
And you do quite a lot of outreach too, don't you, in that respect?
Yeah, and we have seen there are some indications that GDPR is cutting through in people's awareness, and and to Sandra's point, that the stronger regulatory framework is creating more trust in how data is processed in Europe. And that's, I think, where Europe has to be in the end. That's our opportunity, is to be the place where people can go and experiment with how data is used in a way that they know is going to be compliant, privacy respectful, and that they know where the boundaries are. And they don't really have that sense, for different reasons, in the US and China. So there is a space there to occupy.
Thank you. Roger?
Yes, I certainly agree with your point about that we've got to establish trust, but I'm kind of with Dame Wendy here in one sense, in that the thing that I want is, the most amount of data about me, and not, as you say, not inferential data, the real thing, stuff about me, used to make the most accurate and best decisions about me in healthcare. That's what I would like to happen. And what I'd like is a framework that I know that if someone was given that power to do it, that they would do it in a way that was protective of me and that helped me. And what isn't clear at the moment is that we have a framework to do that. So I agree GDPR has got bits and it helps, but it doesn't really deliver the goods in terms of saying, okay, we've got it set up so that you got a degree of control over your data and you can trust it to somebody who will use it to genuinely make decisions that are evidenceable to an independent authority or to a third party in some way that they really have made reasonable, rational, fair, sensible decisions about you. Doesn't require an explanation about me specifically, but overall, it's a defensible system. That's what we need to get to, which would meet Wendy's point about if we don't use these data, the Chinese will just come up with something that is an incredibly effective way of treating people's illnesses. And I'm not sure we're just all going to go no to that because we don't trust it. We might start using it, and that's a pretty bad place to end up.
But it does mean creating a virtuous circle of trust, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely right. And the institutions and the allocation of rights to use data in order to deliver that trustworthy system, we've got pieces of it, but there's a lot of the work that Sandra is doing is kind of trying to put together all the bricks that we need to build that.
And do you think that the GDPR was the right way to start from your point of view, Kathryn?
I think one of the great problems we had was that e-privacy also didn't come in at the same time. So I don't know how many of you are aware of e-privacy regulations, but they were also there supposed to be introduce and harmonize privacy regulations at the same time as GDPR. And so what we're seeing, because of this lack of harmonization of not only across Europe, but with the regulations, is we've got a problem with cookies and advertising in particular. So there isn't, to come back to you, both of you actually, where we haven't got an even distribution of fairness, actually. There are companies that, like Sandra mentions, who do want to be ethical and who are doing things within advertising more ethically. But however, we haven't got, because the regulations aren't clear, for example, France will have a consent of 13 months. There isn't such a same thing within the UK, the same in Italy, that we haven't got a way to easily even get back to advertising companies, let alone companies who are doing things that are way more complicated with way more sensitive data. So I think that, yes, GDPR kind of brought some began this, but because the other regulations didn't come in at the same time, we've got really an uneven kind of regulatory environment at the moment.
That's a very interesting point. By the way, can I just check with the organisers? We've got 3 minutes, right? Okay, and people will come and talk to us afterwards, but not. That isn't the idea at this stage. So no chance to throw it open to everybody. Right, let me just get on to the final issue then. It's this internationalization point, which you've all kind of touched on to some degree. I mean, how frustrating is it that, in a sense, we're all operating slightly in silos? Sandra?
I mean, it's natural. I'm always surprised that people expect ethics to be that thing that all of a sudden unites us. And it's not going to be an easy task. And actually, ethics is also not supposed to be easy. Like, it's about figuring out what's good on a daily basis, iterating your processes and your behavior according to what you think is good, and challenge that on a regular basis. We don't have laws that are applicable to all countries at the same time forever. Why would we have it with ethics? We got to start somewhere. And then similar to, for example, human rights framework, that also started out in countries and then in more countries together, and then it spread out to an international framework. I think the same will come true for that. We've got to start somewhere and building towards a future where we have more harmonized standards.
I like that expression, ethics was never supposed to be easy. I think that's a really good reminder, quite frankly, for those of us who kind of fish in that pool, because sometimes it does appear quite hard to get consensus. Yeah. Simon, you have a lot to do with, in a sense, gatherings of regulators in the same space overseas. I mean, how much consensus is there on these things? I mean, for instance, on what Sandra raised, for instance.
More and more. And it's very easy to get focused on where the differences and the gaps are. And I think it's entirely fair to say that if we're looking for some kind of consistent global ethical framework, everyone has all the same values, then we're going to be looking for a long time. But it's easy to admire the differences and forget that we have a lot in common, whether that's the fact that there's just an awful lot of work going on around the world in this, whether it's that there's some basics that the majority of organizations and countries are going to agree to, or in my case, that we see lots and lots of coordination between the different privacy regulators in this area, and the frameworks still do align. The things I mentioned before, fairness, accountability, notice, all those things are generally thematic, and more countries are embracing that.
It's good. And Roger, you have the weight of expectation on you, in a sense, being a new body, so to speak. I mean, where do you fit in this?
I think we're coming at it from two angles, one of which is we need to recognise that we can do something within one country, and we need to do as much as we can. But we've also got to recognise the fact that, you know, nothing we do with genetic information within the borders of the United Kingdom is going to stop people elsewhere understanding more and more about what the human genes mean. Nothing is going to stop them providing services that people can travel to and move across borders. The degree to which people will even be able to provide services at a distance, it means that the role of borders in this whole area is coming under a huge amount of pressure. We are, as a country, going to have to make some decisions about what we can consider we need in terms of if we wish to have any form of digital border at all. But more importantly, while we try and build the most robust ethical framework within this country, we have got to make the best efforts we can to persuade other countries that the approach we're taking is a sound one, and one that can be adapted to differences, but that the underpinnings of rights over data, of control, of understanding how it's used, that these are things that we can start to build an international agreements about.
Thank you very much. And final word to Kathryn. Have you been reassured by what you've heard today, Kathryn, as a practitioner and an advisor, that we will in future not have to have this kind of regulatory or ethical arbitrage internationally?
Internationally, okay. I guess when I think about it, I think more about how we work as technologists and the practices we already have, such as Agile, and how actually these practices are cross-border. And if we can create some things that are standardized more for how you do things, I think we'll make more progress.
Great.
There we go.
Thank you very much indeed. And can you thank our panel very much? Simon, Roger, Sandra and Kathryn, thank you very much.